Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Nice to see you again. We'll begin with a bow. And then the 7-line prayer. Home on the northwest border of the land of Uddiyana, on the pistil of a lotus flower and stem, you attain supreme wondrous city, renowned as Padmakara, surrounded by a retinue of many Dakinis. Following you, I reach accomplishment. Please come and grant your blessings. Guru Pama Siddhi Om. Light of blessings. In supreme, unchanging, great bliss, Vajradhatu, forefather who emanates and gathers all Kayas and Buddha fields, glorious Saruka, Lord of ocean of Mahakalas, we supplicate the Guru, the primordial Buddha. From the wisdom play of all-pervasive compassion, you continually appeared as the learned and accomplished charioteers of the teachings of India and Tibet, and especially of the Kagyu Enigma. We supplicate you, in particular as the magical emanation of sacred wisdom. Lord, your marvelous virtues of hearing, contemplating, and meditating manifested for our sake as Buddha activity. Choki Gatso, we supplicate at your feet, actualizing the wisdom of ultimate dharmata, confusion exhausted at its base, your spontaneous wisdom came forth, apparent existence perfect as the one mandala of Dharmakaya. We supplicate space, Choki Gatso, by the power of birth and death being naturally pure in enlightenment, with the vision of compassion beyond decrease or increase, looking after us disciples who are left behind, please ripen and free our beings, perfecting the excellent path of the effortless jnana. Glorious Guru, may our minds mix with yours, thoroughly liberated in the youthful body endowed with the 6 qualities. May we perfect the 2 benefits. The Sutra of the Heart of Transcendent Knowledge. Thus have I heard once the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha, Vulture Peak Mountain, together with the great gathering of the Sangha monks and a great gathering of the Sangha Bodhisattvas. At that time, Blessed One entered the Samadhi that expresses the Dharma called profound illumination, and at the same time noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, while practicing the profound Prajnaparamita, saw in this way, saw the 5 skandhas to be empty of nature. Then through the power of the Buddha, Venerable Shariputra said to noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should a son or daughter of noble family train who wishes to practice the profound Prajnaparamita, in this way, noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, said to Venerable Shariputra, O Shariputra, son or daughter of noble family who wishes to practice the profound Prajnaparamita should see in this way, seeing the 5 skandhas to be empty of nature. Form is emptiness, emptiness also is form, emptiness is no other than form, form is no other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness are emptiness. Shariputra, all dharmas are emptiness. There are no characteristics, there is no birth, no cessation, there is no impurity, and no purity, there is no decrease, and no increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, no eye, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no appearance, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no dharmas, no dhatu, up to, no mind, dhatu, no dhatu of dharmas, no mind consciousness, dhatu, no ignorance, end of ignorance, up to old age and death, no end of old age and death, suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, path, no wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, since bodhisattvas have no attainment, they abide by means of prajnaparamita. Since there is no obscuration of mind, there is no fear, they transcend falsity and attain complete nirvana. The Buddhas of the three times by means of prajnaparamita fully awake to unsurpassable true complete enlightenment. Therefore the great mantra of prajnaparamita, great insight, the unsurpassed mantra, the unequaled mantra, the mantra that calms all suffering, should be known as truth, since there is no deception. The Prajnaparamita mantra is said in this way: Om Gate Gate Para Gate Para Samgate Bodhisattva Shariputra. The Bodhisattva Mahasattva should train in the profound Prajnaparamita. Then Blessed One arose from that samadhi and praised noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, saying, Good, good, O son of noble family, thus it is, O son of noble family, thus it is, should practice the profound Prajnaparamita, just as you have taught, and all the Tathagatas will rejoice. The Blessed One had said this, venerable Shariputra and noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, that whole assembly and the world with its gods, Mensasaras and Gandharvas rejoiced and praised the words of the Blessed One. We'll sit for 10 minutes. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining me, both those of you who are in the room, and those of you who are wherever that is. Last week, we began by talking about different frameworks for understanding the background of these teachings. There's the historical framework, very contemporary idea. There's the traditional, somewhat hagiographic presentation of the background of these teachings. And there's the Four Schools presentation, which is a way of organizing the different views that are presented in these teachings. And all of these are constructs, they're mental constructs, they're ways of making sense of the past. So even though they don't agree, that's not particularly a problem because we can't find a real past to compare any of them to. So they're just methods for us to try to organize our understanding of these teachings. We also began to talk about the first of the four schools, the Vaibhashikas. And I think we'll begin tonight by continuing where we left off with the Vaibhashika school. And I wanted to say that it's natural to want to get to the highest view, the most profound teachings. But the purpose of this Four Schools presentation, particularly the way I'm approaching it, is not from the point of view of the marketing department of the highest school. Because the marketing department's always going to tell you our way is the best and only way to understand these teachings and to liberate yourself. The views are progressively more subtle, but for us, that may not necessarily be something that we're that keen on. We may not need to get to the most subtle view. Maybe the most coarse view is going to be the most helpful for us now. And my emphasis in this is not so much on the views of the schools as the methods that they use to illuminate the what is genuine reality from what is apparent or deceptive reality. So thinking back to the image of the rope snake, each of these schools has different ways of removing the mistaken view of a snake in the rope. So the Vaibhashika method is basically analyzing things that seem to be wholes and taking them apart, analyzing, deconstructing things that seem to be wholes that we normally consider entities, things, real things, and showing that they're all composed of parts, so they don't truly exist. So it appears that there is such a thing as a forest, but the forest is just a bunch of trees. And as someone pointed out last week, the tree is just a bunch of leaves and twigs and roots and so on. An army is composed of a bunch of people. There's no army itself, there's just the people, and you can break that down. A beach is a bunch of grains of sand. So the Vaibhashikas are particularly interested in that whole, that seeming whole, that snake, which is called the self. So we didn't get last week to the contemplation about the skandhas, about the aggregates. And I thought it would be helpful if we spent a little time doing that together. So aggregate or skandha, there are different translations for the Sanskrit term skandha. There's aggregate is one of them, but heap is probably a little bit closer to it. There's one very poetic translation, which I like, which is the disintegrating collections, which really gives you the feeling of how the skandhas aren't any one thing. They're just bunches of stuff that is coming into and going out of existence in every moment. So there are, according to the Vaibhashikas and other schools, there are 5 skandhas. There is the skandha of form, which is basically the things that appear to our senses to be actual things like bodies. And then there are the 4 other skandhas, the skandha of feelings, or how we react to things emotionally, either wanting to go toward them or away from them or ignore them. There's the perceptions, the various characteristics that we see in things, that we attribute to things. There's the mental formations, the various ways that our mind appears to ourselves. And then there are the consciousnesses, which, according to the Vaibhashikas, there's 6 consciousnesses, one for each of the 5 things that we consider to be senses, plus a mental sense. And there's 6 consciousnesses for these 6. And the challenge that the Vaibhashikas present is, can any of the skandhas or the entirety of the skandhas be the self? Since forms are continually changing, feelings are changing, perceptions are changing, mental formations are changing, consciousnesses are changing all the time. They're all different. Which of these, or which collection of these, could be the self? Since the Vaibhashikas determine that any collection doesn't really exist, it's just an imputation, a mental imposition on our experience, where are we going to find the self in the skandhas? So the way they contemplate this is by asking either the aggregates, the skandhas, the disintegrating collections are the self, or one of them's the self, or the self is something different from the aggregates, which is a little hard to imagine since the skandhas consist of everything we experience. If it's something other than the skandhas, we'd have to be able to experience it. So this is a method for looking for the self in our experience and categorizing our experience in these 5 ways and seeing if any or all or a set of these could be what we think to be this singular, permanent, independent self. So we have this verse which comes from Nagarjuna, from the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, which in itself is interesting just because we're talking about the Vaibhashikas, one of the Abhidharma schools, much earlier than Nagarjuna, but this type of investigation is important enough for Nagarjuna to include it as well. It stays into the Mahayana because it's so central to us, this clinging to a self. So I'd like to do this together the way we did the contemplations last week, which is that we will read it together and then we'll contemplate for a couple of minutes, and then I will read it to you, contemplate another couple of minutes, and then we'll have a little discussion. If the self were the aggregates, it would be something that arises and ceases. If the self were something other than the aggregates, it would not have the aggregates' characteristics. If the self were the aggregates, it would be something that arises and ceases. If the self were something other than the aggregates, it would not have the aggregates' characteristics. If the self were the aggregates, it would be something that arises and ceases. If the self were something other than the aggregates, it would not have the aggregates' characteristics. So, did you find the self? Jen?
The self here is defined as something independent, permanent, and so forth, because otherwise it is something that
Independent.
arises and ceases.
Yeah, independent, permanent, and singular. I mean, it's defined that way because that's how it seems to be to us.
Rather than something that arises and ceases.
Yeah. So did you find one?
I found something that arises and ceases.
Was it the self?
Not by that definition, no.
Yeah, but experientially, did it feel like me? I mean you.
The feeling changes fairly frequently.
Yeah.
But what's me?
What else?
I've got a voice really saying this is me.
You have a voice saying that.
Yeah.
Okay. So is that voice one of the aggregates? One of the, which one?
I don't remember. Is it mine? Is it
Consciousness? That one?
yeah. Yeah. I don't remember this.
So the five are forms, feelings,
Yeah.
perceptions, which are aware of characteristics, mental formations, and consciousnesses. So it seemed to be mental formation. And did it last the whole time?
Well, it started justifying itself.
It does that.
And I feel like there's moments of noticing rising and falling, but that there's still an underlying sense of a knower that's very persistent.
Who else?
It seems that when we look at what the skandhas are, they seem to be almost like reactions to environment. They seem to be, form. We have a reaction to what our senses are experiencing and then feeling, whether we're pushing away or we're pulling it or we're ignoring it, how we're perceiving things and how we're conceptualizing it and how our consciousness deals with it. And it's like, how could it be permanent if it's reacting to changing circumstances? The circumstances are always changing. So our experiences of form, feeling, perception are going to change with those circumstances. And it could almost say that, well, the self is there, and the way that it reacts to its environment is the manifestation, like the skandhas are a manifestation of how the self reacts, rather than it being the self at the same time. And that way, I guess the last two words could be, you could have an exception. You could say if the self were something other than the aggregates, it would not have the aggregates characteristics. But if the aggregates are the way or a description of how the self reacts to environment, then it could have those characteristics if that's how it manifests in reality.
The question is that a self, or is that just a bunch of random arising and falling?
Well, I guess ultimately that's what we're trying to figure out, and we can't find it. But I guess one of the things that also confuses me a little bit is if the self are the aggregates, it would be something that arises and ceases. And okay, so maybe Okay, so maybe the self is impermanent, and maybe the self does arise and cease depending on what the circumstances are.
Is your sense of self impermanent?
It's certainly not fixed, and it's all over the place depending on what's going on in my life.
Okay. Scott?
Where in the skandhas do we get that experience of trying to make everything whole? You know, like always trying to join the seams so that it's seamless. Yeah, where's that? What part of the skandhas usually is responsible for that?
Whose job is that?
Whose job is that?
Why are they doing such a crappy job?
Is that a fifth skandha thing? Is it consciousness, or is that happening at our mental formations? Or
So here's another way of tackling this. Which skandha is looking for the self?
Perception. So there's no answer.
I'm inclined to think that it would be somewhere in somewhere between the mental formations and consciousness, but I've also read Kempo Saltram say usually we have a problem with the idea of selflessness. It's usually an emotional blockage.
Yeah.
Somewhere in Vedana.
Let's
feelings.
not worry about what we've read. We're
Okay.
just looking at what we experience. Kathy, do you have something to report?
Not this moment.
Okay.
Well, it seems it's easy. I'm wondering about consciousness because it's not obvious to me that consciousness it's a different consciousness that experiences sound, sight, mental contents, etc. That's not obvious to me. Like it's easy for me to assume that it's something, consciousness, is experiencing all of that. So that this kind of it would be something that arises and ceases, seems to me, that logic seems to be predicated on the fact that the different what experiences, hearing, sight, mental contents, etc., is a different consciousness each time. And that's not obvious in my experience.
So it feels like there's just one consciousness that kind of has different tentacles, like an octopus.
I think, therefore, I think I am.
Yeah. But is that how it feels? That it's like one thing with different?
Well, I realize that investigation and analysis, it might turn out to be an assumption, but it's easy to feel like it's central headquarters.
It was a long time ago, we were put through a contemplative exercise with this, where we were examining the skandhas and consciousnesses and whatnot. Okay, is this the self? Is this the self? Is this the self? And we were led through it, and eventually we were just backed into a corner with I think the sixth consciousness, which I guess is depicted like a monkey trying to at the controls panel. And is that a self? And feeling I got then, and even when I'm doing this contemplation now, is that it's interdependent. It doesn't have a sense of actually being a core, as it is it's something that's just,
So it arises and ceases.
it is arising and ceasing. Yeah, I mean, depending upon what's being demanded, like you were saying, Alex.
Peter, do you have any? How about your people?
Yeah, I'm looking, no one's posed a question yet. Just for anyone sitting back here, you guys are being picked up by the microphone. We have to speak louder because they really want to hear us online. Thank you.
Okay, let's go a little further with this. There are two levels of this mistaken sense of self. There's the imputed level, the conceptual level that we get from our lives, from our educations, that I'm a chemist, I'm a male, I'm a bald person, blah, blah, blah. All of the, I have a career as a banker. All of these things go into making up this imputed self, which is relatively easy to deconstruct. Because if I say I'm a chemist, well, sometimes I go and play basketball. Then am I a basketball player? Am I a basketball player and a chemist? We can show fairly easily that these collections of imputations that we call the self don't stick. They don't capture this self. The more subtle level of the self is the innate self, which is that basic sense of being a subject of experience. That whenever, I think, Paul, you were talking about this, whenever there's experience, there's a sense of being located in relation to that experience. That the self is inside, the experience is outside, in some sense. That's much more subtle. It's also something that arises and ceases with each experience. I think you were talking about this, Alex, that sense of subjectivity, of being a subject of experience, arises with whatever is being experienced. And then, and the next experience, and it feels like it's come up again. It's discontinuous, but it seems to us to be continuous. So this is the subtler level of selfhood, which is harder to get at, harder to deconstruct, because we try to get at it from that subjectivity. So it's like the self is seeking for the self, so it must be real because it's able to look for the self. But there's something wrong with that. There's some fundamental flaw in the system, because that's not continuous. It's not, in the absence of something being experienced, there's no experiencer.
Can you repeat that, please?
In the absence of something being experienced, there's no experiencer. So in the absence of form, there's no experiencer of form. In the absence of feeling, there's no feeler. And our experience tends to rise and fall all the time. And it seems like there must be somebody home that's the one who's experiencing. But that experiencer is also momentary. So rather than discuss that right now, we're going to do the other.
Just one comment, sorry.
Please.
From online, it seems to me that consciousness is the servant. Formation is actually what desperately grasps to create a self moment to moment.
Okay, that makes some sense. So what I wanted to do was to go to the next contemplation, which is really short. And it comes from what's known as the four mistaken conceptions. These are like core mistakenness that we all experience. We take what is unclean to be clean, what is impermanent to be permanent, what is suffering to be happiness, and what is not a self to be a self. These are like the big four. So we'll do a short contemplation of this one phrase. We have taken what is not a self to be a self. And we don't need to recite it. We'll just do that for a couple of minutes. And again, we'll just look to see what is it that we take to be a self. Okay. This type of investigation, this method that the Vaibhashikas present, is so central to the Buddhist path, the Buddhist journey altogether. And it's one that we should come back to again and again. You can do it briefly, or you could spend a whole meditation session looking for the self, but it's something that is very central and essential. I want to move on now to the next school, the Sautrantika school, the followers of Sutra. But I don't want to just say, oh, we did that and it's done. This is like something that should bother you for a long time. It still bothers me, so I want you to be equally plagued. In introducing the Sautrantikas, I have to be careful not to go down a rabbit hole because I really want to. I'm really tempted. So I'm going to try to do this fairly simply and then get into the method of the Sautrantikas. But you should at least hear a little bit about this. And this comes from the historical construct of the teachings. We have no traces of the Sautrantikas. I don't think the Tibetans had any traces of them either. None of their own teachings, none of their texts survive. We don't have any location for them, for any groups of them, any famous teachers of them. The main historical telling of the Sautrantikas is in a very important text by Vasubandhu, who we'll talk about maybe next week or the week after at a little more length. But he wrote the Abhidharma Kosha, the treasury of Abhidharma, which was based on his studies of the with the Vaibhashikas in Kashmir. He spent 3 years in Kashmir studying with the main Vaibhashika teachers of his time. He came back to forgotten, Gandhara, I think is where, I'm not sure, where he lived. And then he taught this system of the Vaibhashikas. And he wrote several hundred verses, maybe 900 verses, I'm not sure, laying out their system. So the story goes that during the day, he presented the Vaibhashika system, and at night he wrote an auto-commentary on the verses that he had composed during the day on the Vaibhashika system, often attacking those positions from the Sautrantika point of view. So Vasubandhu's auto-commentary on the Abhidharma Kosha is the main record we have that there was maybe this school. But the methods of the school are particularly interesting and valuable. So whether there's a historical basis for them or not, we're going to get into that. I think I stayed out of the rabbit hole. In the Treasury of Knowledge, Jamgam Kumtrul gives verses that present the core view of the four schools. And they're all in the form of how you distinguish a rope from a snake, how you distinguish what is genuine reality from apparent reality. So the verse that he gives for the Sutra school is things that are ultimately able to perform functions or not, which are characterized as specifics or generalities. This is the tradition of the followers of the sutras. So things that are ultimately able to perform functions or not able to perform functions, which are specifics or generalities. So you have the two pairs. Things that can perform functions are specifics, things that can't are generalities. So, for example, your thought about an orange is not something you can eat. It's a generality. It doesn't perform the function of an orange. In Western philosophy, we talk about generalities and particulars, which is the same sort of notion. A generality is a concept. A particular is a moment of actual experience. So this could go sideways really quickly, but we're going to not let it do that. The traditional terms that are used for these two categories of things are specifically characterized phenomena and generally characterized phenomena. A moment of visual experience is a specifically characterized phenomena. It appears to your mind. It's an object for a sense consciousness, including the mental consciousness. So the six senses experience things specifically. When you look at this shrine, the moment of visual perception is specifically characterized. It's detailed. You see the whole visual field. The thought, a shrine, is a generally characterized phenomena. It's not something that arises in detail. When you have the thought of a shrine, it's a generality. It's not detailed, it's vague, but it appears to your mind. Normally, when we talk about thoughts, we're thinking just of the narrative function of thoughts, the descriptive, the words of the thoughts. But those words are always describing something else that appeared to your mind and then you narrate to yourself. And those objects that appear to the mind are generalities. They're generally characterized phenomena. If I say the Empire State Building, something will come to your mind, but it will not be like a photograph of the Empire State Building. It will not be looking at it from a particular angle at street level, for example, or you're up in the observation deck looking at the tower or something. It'll be this general thing that appears to your mind and you label it, oh yeah, Empire State Building, New York City. I was there. Parenthetically, I'll remark that when I was a kid growing up on the Upper West Side, my bedroom window faced the Empire State Building, about 4 miles away, and I really liked looking at it. And then they built another building next door that blocked the view.
Impermanence.
So this distinction between these different types of objects that appear to our minds is the Sutra school's way of dissecting the snake. Because the snake is always a generality. When you see the striped rope clearly, it's a specifically characterized, it's a particular, it's a visual form. That's all it is. You have a visual experience. Tu caught. That's it. But then it's a snake. Something else happens in your mind. And then you start narrating that. Perception and conception. These are the two basic functions that we have going on all the time. And we mix them, we blend them together. There's a psychological term called cognitive fusion. We're fusing two things that are dissimilar. When we look at the shrine, all we see is color and shape. But superimposed on that color and shape is the notion of shrine. There's this, it's a thing. It's not just a visual experience. There's something there. When we see a person, there's a first moment of seeing that person, and then maybe there's the next moment of recognizing them. Oh, that's Annie. Annie is my friend. And we take that concept of Annie and the concept of friend and think it's part of this same thing that the visual form is. We blend them together. And we react to them. We don't react to particulars. We react to generalities. That's what's driving the show all the time. So this is another method of pulling apart our delusion, distinguishing, finding the joints in reality and cutting right at the joint. And it's a fantastic method for a practitioner, because when you're practicing, what's going to arise in your mind? A lot of generalities.
Well, nothing else can.
Well, no, you'll have visual experiences. You might feel your fingers are cold or your butt is sore, things like that. You'll have other things arising in your mind, some particulars, some specifically characterized phenomena, but there's nothing like sitting for an hour to encounter a lot of generalities and watching them bloom and bloom and bloom. And not being able to distinguish them from the particulars we think we're thinking about. Alex, make it brief.
Other than direct experience through our senses, everything else is generality, it's more civic. Sort of,
We're gonna have to,
field.
we're gonna have to qualify that later on, because there is mental direct experience as well. But that's gonna take us into a, well, not a rabbit hole, but it'll probably obscure the sharp point of this spear. It'll kind of dull it a little. So let's try to stick with, yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions? So when you're sitting and you're thinking about some jerk who cut you off when you were driving, is the jerk present? What do we experience at that point? Generality. So this can be a very helpful way to deal with our projections, to distinguish them from the thing we think we're thinking about. Do you have anything, Peter?
Okay.
Okay, let's do a brief contemplation to illustrate this. There's no text for this one. Listen to whatever sounds there are. And here, out there, wherever you are, just take a few minutes and listen to the sounds. When you hear a sound, just keep listening, please. When you hear a sound, is it mixed with a name? I hear the air conditioner or the heat pump. Can you hear just the sound? When you're sitting and you hear the sound of a taxi or a car, do you just hear the sound or do you hear the car? It seems like we hear the car, doesn't it?
It almost arises at the same time, and unless you aren't quite sure what it is.
I'm not quite sure what that was. It was cool. So this is a really good example of how we blend these generalities with particulars. Remember, the definition that Jamgam Kumchol gives of the view of this school is whatever is able to perform a function or not. Specific, particular, those things perform functions. Generalities do not perform functions. So the actual heat pump can warm the room, but our thought of the heat pump cannot. It's not doing a great job of warming the room either.
So, and is it, when we say our projection, is our conception, or like, is that projection?
Well, projection is, I think, a very helpful term for this in English, but it's not like it's coming out of us. It's like it's appearing in our minds. So it's projected by mind.
So they would be the conception part of it, thinking that's a heat pump, is a projection?
So why that's helpful is that normally we think I'm in here and reality is out there. But what's happening is our mind is moving out there, and then in here we're thinking about it. We're having discursive reactions to it. So because there's seemingly a here and a there, it feels like it's a projection. That's why we use that term, but it's all stuff appearing in mind. Yeah.
A question online. They say that some people have highly detailed visual memories or concepts. Can you repeat that?
No, I got it. I just wondered if there was more.
No,
Yes. So we all have both. We have lots of different types of generalities, and there are actual terms for the different types. There's form generalities, there's, do you remember, Scott, the different categories? Term generalities, form generalities. Anyhow, yes, there are more or less detailed different types of things that appear that are still generalities. But I may be mistaken. I don't think they are ever as detailed as particulars, as visual forms, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think about someone who isn't around anymore, sometimes you think what comes to mind is the image of a photograph of that person. And it's not as clear as a photograph, but it's in the shape, more or less, of that photograph. It's a type of generality.
Is it possible to, in the case of sound, for instance, is it possible to deconstruct the the fusion.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not like we're going to be able to have one over here and one.
Experience the sound.
Yeah,
and
well-
sort of bring your mind towards just the sound without the label, without the construct. To touch it.
Sure, but that's not so much the point. What's more interesting, actually, is being able to see both, to recognize that there are two things happening. So, you know, in the rope snake example, there's a visual experience, and then in the next moment, there's a snake, right? So there's this particular followed by the generality. Once you recognize that that second thing is a generality, it's something appearing in your mind, it's not something in the phenomenal world that's going to bite you, you're free. You're liberated from the fear, from the whatever it is about snakes. Friends and enemies. One of the things that Khenpo Tsotrong Gyamtso did a lot when he talked about this kind of thing was he'd bring it down to some really important things. So often teachings on the view, they talk about pillars and pots. Those are the two classical things they use to talk about stuff. We talk about tables on chairs often, but he'd bring it down to friends and enemies. That was one of the key things that he talked about a lot, because we don't distinguish the actual appearance of another person from our conception of them, our generality of them. It's very hard for us to do. We believe the generality is part of that person. As a result, when someone is doing something, it's very hard for us to actually see what they're doing, because we project whatever it is onto the situation before it's happening or as it's happening. Your friend comes in the room, you don't notice their particular state of mind or how they're manifesting, particularly in that moment, because you think, oh, there's my friend, blah, 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 blah. My agenda, blah, 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 blah. So
That's the snake.
that's the snake, exactly. We're always caught up in our version of friends and enemies, which gives us very little freedom to actually deal with the other, with the person, whoever it is. That's why this is really important and useful, because it's a way of helping us distinguish our version or our projection, or however you want to talk about it, the snake in the room, from someone who's just appearing. And so instead of being able to react to what that person needs in the moment, we're reacting to our version of them. Well, the storyline is also part of it. The storyline kind of nails the whole thing together. But even before there's a story, there's the feeling of it. So I personally have found this presentation, this method of the Sutra School, to be really, really helpful for my practice. And for years, it was kind of one of the core methods that I would draw on as I practiced, to distinguish the things that were appearing in my mind from what I thought they were. Any other thoughts and questions as we get to the end of our time?
just make a comment and maybe ask a question. I find that when we're doing our exercise, listening to the sounds, that being relaxed really helps in just hearing the sound. Because it's kind of nice hearing that car engine up there. I didn't think car engine, I just felt the vibration. It was kind of nice. But you do identify it eventually too. I don't know how to formulate this question. Maybe I shouldn't ask it. Regards to the technique of this school, and how do we bring, what sort of practices can we bring this into? All of them?
Well, both are sitting practice where it can help us, particularly when we're having kleshas. Kleshas are a great opportunity to distinguish the generalities that are appearing to your mind from the specific characteristics of the feeling of what you're experiencing, or distinguish the projection from the actual person that you're pissed off at or whatever. So kleshas are a great opportunity to use this in practice. General life situation, noticing how much we superimpose our generalities on situations. But I guess kleshas are really the best. Peter?
Question from online. People are hardwired to create patterns out of perception. That's the generality, right?
Yes. And we can't unwire that. We don't need to unwire it, but we need to distinguish it. That's the thing. Because we can't tell what's rope and what's snake, we think the rope is a snake. We think the mirage is water.
So our feelings are specifics?
Our feelings, before we start describing them to ourselves, are specific, sure.
That sense or the...
Yeah, I mean, that's why there's so many practices about feeling your feelings.
Yes.
Feeling them rather than knowing them.
Yes.
Soni Rinpoche, in his handshake practice, often says, don't know your feelings, don't know what you're feeling, feel them. So you're getting into the distinction between the specific, the particular of the feeling, which is just what it is, and the generality of, oh, I feel shitty, I better go have a drink or whatever it is.
So is that another way of saying what you just said, distinguish the things that were appearing in my mind from what I thought they were?
Yeah.
It's just another
Well, that's
way.
the ungluing process. So I think that's our time for tonight. If you have more questions about this or thoughts about this during the week, we can discuss them at the beginning of next week's class. And I don't know quite what we'll do, but we may do a little more of this and then get into the next school, Chittamatra. And then I'm really going to go down a rabbit hole. Let's conclude with the long life prayer for Khyentse Rinpoche. Om Svasti, Skull Garland, Lotus Aruka, conqueror of Maras, whose deathless natural wisdom mind has transformed of existence into great Vajra bliss, subjugator of apparent phenomena, please shower the blessings of immortality. Fearless Lord of speech, you are the Vajra holder of the profound secret treasures. and compassion, victorious one of all pervading activity, may your three secrets remain indestructible and everlasting, as vowed by Vimala and King Trisan Yatsun to constantly manifest out of compassion. You came as a warrior to protect the doctrine and all beings in this dark age. May you remain forever as the unchanging Vajra essence. May the virtuous seed of this supplication, warmed and moistened by the undeceiving two truths, ripen into a splendid fruit that beautifies the three worlds with utmost auspiciousness. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. I, the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you all.